Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're driving straight into a fascinating, peer-reviewed medical mystery published in Nature Human Behavior. We're going to look at American society, but definitely not through your typical polling data or election maps. Instead, we're peering through the lens of individual medical records and mortality data spanning decades. We're going to see exactly how something as abstract as ideology is having a very literal, measurable impact on human biology.
So let's kick things off with a pretty wild question. Could your political beliefs actually affect your physical health? I mean, we all know our politics dictate how we vote, where we get our news, maybe even who we hang out with. But could the ideology you align with actually show up in your blood work? Could it change your lifespan? For a long time, the science on this was kind of muddy, mostly relying on people self-reporting their health or just looking at broad county-level data. But this new research, it takes a radically different, highly objective approach to answer that exact question.
To get to the bottom of this, researchers started with a concept public health experts call social determinants of health. Usually we're talking about non-medical things here, your income, your education level, how safe your neighborhood is, stuff like that. These factors are super well documented in how they shape our health. But in this study, the authors bring a really bold, brand new thesis to the table. Political belief is now a measurable determinant of human health. Just like your zip code or your education, the way you engage with politics is literally shaping your physical well-being.
Section 1. A new health determinant. To really nail this down, scientists relied on an absolute gold mine of data called the Ad Health Survey. This survey is the backbone of the whole investigation because it let researchers track the exact same nationally representative group of Americans over decades. We're talking about a group of people who were in middle and high school back in the 1990s. Researchers checked in on them in early adulthood around 2001, then again around 2008, followed up in 2016 for midlife changes, and finally cross-referenced their files against national mortality records up to 2022. By tracking the exact same individuals over all those years, they could see precisely how shifting political ideologies mapped onto actual health changes as these people aged. Moving right along to Section 2, tracking the health gap. Now, when it came to the biological data, the researchers didn't just ask, hey, how you feeling today? Because, let's be real, that's incredibly subjective. Instead, trained professionals literally went into people's homes and measured 5 highly objective biological clues: blood pressure, cholesterol, blood glucose, body mass index, and inflammation. They then rolled all of these into a comorbidity index, which is basically just a combined score of health risks, to get a scientifically rigorous, totally impartial snapshot of everyone's physical health. And wow, the data gives us our first massive clue. Back in 2008, there was virtually zero health gap based on someone's politics. A liberal and a conservative had practically the exact same biomarker profile. But fast forward just 8 years to 2016, and a stark divide had suddenly emerged. By 2016, the most conservative respondents showed significantly higher comorbidity scores than their liberal peers. They literally became less healthy over that specific 8-year window, showing worse markers across those exact 5 objective categories we just talked about. Section 3. The widening mortality divide. So, what did these shifting biomarkers mean in the real world by the early 2020s? Well, by linking the survey data to the CDC's National Death Index, the researchers uncovered a pretty stark reality. People who identified as very conservative actually had a 1.14 percentage point higher probability of internally caused death between 2020 and 2022 compared to very liberal respondents. Now, you might hear 1.14 percentage points and think, that sounds pretty small. But remember, we are talking about mortality rates for adults who were only in their early 40s. In that context, this is a massive, statistically significant divide. It is a literal divergence in human life expectancy. You might be wondering what exactly was driving this rising death rate. Was it just external stuff like car crashes? Nope. The data showed basically zero link between ideology and external accidents. The gap was entirely driven by internal diseases, things like cancer, heart disease, and strokes. These are the exact conditions linked to those biomarkers that started slipping back in 2016. And I know what you might be yelling at your screen right now. What about COVID? Well, the data shows this mortality gap persists even when you completely exclude COVID-19 deaths. This isn't just a pandemic story. It is a fundamental, structural shift in health. Which brings us to Section 4, shifting political demographics. So what on earth is driving this shift? Well, clue number 1 is a massive demographic reshuffling between the political parties over the course of the study. Basically, the makeup of who identifies as liberal and who identifies as conservative changed. The liberal coalitions saw gains in socioeconomic advantages that naturally correlate with better health, like higher education, higher income, and better access to health insurance. Meanwhile, the conservative coalition saw gains in other health-promoting factors, like higher rates of marriage and religiosity. But when you balance it all out, those socioeconomic gains in the liberal camp exerted a much stronger protective force on their overall health markers.
Statisticians crunched the numbers on all of this and found that these observable demographics, the education, the income, the lifestyle factors, explain about 50% of the widening health divide we saw in 2016. But that means the researchers were left staring at a massive 50% that was just a total unexplained mystery. Even when they compared liberals and conservatives living in the exact same county with similar demographics, the conservatives were still experiencing worse health outcomes. So they had to look beyond demographics entirely. They had to look at our behavior.
Section 5. The Trust Deficit. To crack that remaining 50% of the mystery, the researchers fielded a massive, brand-new survey in 2024 of over 21,000 Americans specifically to measure their willingness to engage with the medical system. And the conclusion they reached is pretty striking. Political beliefs, by shaping trust, engagement, and adherence to medical advice, have become an important social determinant of health. Basically, people aren't just voting differently. Based on their politics, they are fundamentally interacting with the very institution of medicine differently.
The survey numbers are incredibly revealing. Right-leaning respondents reported significantly less trust, basically across the board when it came to healthcare. We're talking less trust in their own primary care doctors, less likelihood of following the advice of an ER doctor, and a decreased belief in the efficacy of their chronic medications. Just think about that for a second. Even for non-COVID chronic illnesses like high blood pressure or diabetes, conservative respondents were significantly more likely to question whether the life-saving medications prescribed by their own doctors were actually safe and effective.
They even tested this with a hypothetical scenario to see how it played out in practice. They asked respondents to imagine they were lifting something heavy and suddenly felt a terrible pain in their chest. The pain makes them feel sick, but it wears off after a few minutes. How likely are they to go to the doctor? This is where the behavioral shift gets super profound. Right-leaning respondents reported being significantly less likely to schedule that critical appointment. It shows us that a deficit in trust isn't just a feeling. It can actually delay life-saving emergency care when literally every minute counts.
Finally, our conclusion: a vulnerable future. Wrapping up this explainer, the data points to a really clear objective reality. A growing health gap emerged in the 2010s, and it widened into real mortality differences by the 2020s. It's being driven by this 1-2 punch of demographic reshuffling and really stark, measurable polarization in medical trust. It basically tells us that right-leaning Americans are becoming increasingly vulnerable to preventable health risks simply because they're pulling away from the medical system. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the very institution of medicine has become polarized, if a doctor's white coat is no longer viewed as a neutral, trusted symbol by half the country, how can doctors successfully reach and protect all Americans in the future? Thanks for exploring this fascinating data with me.